Hello, uh, my name's Estelle Marshall, and I'm wanting to talk to you today about hereditary spastic paraplegia and a study I did for my dissertation. So this is me. So my background is that of a physiotherapist. So I qualified as a physio in 2002, worked for East Lancs NHS, and I absolutely loved my career. But in 2018, I was diagnosed with HSP, hereditary spastic paraplegia, which impacted my career. At the time, I was working as a community physiotherapist, um, and as such, you're responsible for other people's balance, not just your own. So I was unable to continue in the role. So I then went and did hand therapy for 4 years. But due to many of the symptoms, particularly things like the fatigue impacting my cognitive ability, I retired. I retired last year, so 2024 got my retirement. But I have done a master's, and the research I chose to do was that of looking at hereditary spastic paraplegia and physiotherapy. So I did a questionnaire completed by over 100 people, literally just over 100, and I interviewed 9 people. So these were the objectives for the study, which was to identify ways to improve the diagnosis process, including support and information provided. So to do that, it's looking at what people's experience of the diagnosis process was, looking at what information people were provided with and what support they were offered. To find out also, as a physiotherapist, I think physiotherapy is wonderful, and I've had some very positive experiences of physiotherapy. But how much is it impacting people with HSP, and how much does it influence the long term? In the NHS, I say we, the NHS is only able to provide short-term care, short-term services for people with long-term conditions. So it's a case of equipping the person with the skills required for them to self-manage in the long term. And how well is physiotherapy doing this? Okay. So looking at the diagnosis process, it was lengthy and very difficult, quite traumatic for people. A misdiagnosis is still currently a problem. So some people raised the issue of poor communication, that they felt they didn't know what was going on. They were going for tests, but didn't understand what them tests were and why. But then other people had more positive experiences of friendly and professional staff who explained things. And actually that did make a real difference. So the communication and explanation of what's going on and why those tests are being done are so important to people. So one of the things that did actually surprise me, given the fact that it's a genetic condition, is that 16% of participants had no prior awareness of HSP. Now, obviously, some genes, like the one I carry, which is SPG7, is a recessive gene. So nobody in my family has HSP. Sorry about the cats. You two, could get on. So nobody in my family's got HSP. So there's other people with recessive forms. There's also people with de novo. So new gene mutation that's not been passed on from family members, but just occurred in them. But there's also people with dominant genes who had no prior awareness of HSP. Now, this can partly be because their relatives were misdiagnosed, or the, the relatives weren't diagnosed, or didn't explain to them about what condition they had. So, the people being found out about HSP on a parent's death certificate, which really isn't great, having not known what was wrong with the parent. So a lack of communication. But HSP impacts every part of somebody's life. Now, I said about how it impacted my career. And when I went to work in hand therapy, I had to take a drop in hours because with the level of fatigue I was already having at that point, I wasn't able to work the longer days that I had been previously. So I went down to 22.5 hours, which had an impact on my financial life. So it impacts your relationships. For me, unfortunately, it was a contributing factor towards my divorce after being married for 25 years. It's not, the sole reason, but it certainly didn't help. When you're going through something like the diagnosis of a progressive neurological condition, it's really difficult to continue functioning. So you can end up shutting yourself off from people. It has such a huge impact that it's how you deal with that can have those impacts to the relationships. It can impact everyday life. So as the symptoms get worse, everyday activities become more difficult, such as the trip to the supermarket. It's not as easy. You've got to make sure it's at a time when you've got fatigue. You need to use a walking aid, carrying the bags, putting him in and out the car. These things that actually are normally quite easy become more difficult. So gradually your life becomes more challenging. Okay, so it looked at the impact of the diagnosis. Now, for some people, there was an element of relief, and this was because they were worried that it could be something worse, such as MND, which is in the same family, the cousins of each other, so have huge overlap of symptoms. So there's a relief that it's not going to impact their life expectancy. Also, unfortunately, quite a lot of people at the beginning of neurological conditions, this happens with other conditions as well, are told that it's in the head. They're basically fobbed off by healthcare professionals who say, well, can't see anything wrong. Maybe you're just a hypochondriac, sort of thing. So there's an element of relief that actually they did the right thing in pursuing it. But even those that experienced some relief also experienced some negative emotions, such as grief, bereavement. There was denial, shock, disbelief. So even when people were expecting a diagnosis of a progressive neurological condition, it still hits you like a ton of bricks. So literally, you're like, the reality of it is just like, wow. And you can't take on board or continue listening to what's being told because actually it's like a ton of bricks. And for me, that was the word hereditary. I have two children. I didn't know if it was a dominant gene or recessive. I didn't know if I'd pass it on to my kids. So there was a real fear for my children at the point at which I was diagnosed. And that, I think, was probably one of the hardest for me. For those people who had family history, the overall expression was that of sadness. They sort of knew what was coming because they'd seen that happen to other family members, them getting gradually worse and worse. The experiences of loss and depression and anxiety were quite common, but one young lady even said, she was diagnosed just as she was approaching her GCSEs, and actually she failed all her exams because she was so stressed about everything that was going on. So it's really difficult for people going through diagnosis process and reaching a level of acceptance took people quite a long time, and not everybody got to that point. That was filling it in. Those that the diagnosis impacted less were those that were either too young to understand, so people who'd grown up with the knowledge that they had HSP, and actually it was their parents who'd gone through the bereavement process when they were diagnosed. Or those that were previously misdiagnosed, so people that were misdiagnosed with things like MS or Parkinson's, or even cerebral palsy. I spoke to one young lady that got interviewed who'd grown up being told that she had cerebral palsy. And it was only as an adult that actually they did the genetic tests and found that she had hereditary spastic paraplegia, not cerebral palsy. But unfortunately, this particular young lady, they withdrew a lot of the support because it was through a cerebral palsy clinic that she'd been getting support. And it's like, well, so you're changing the diagnosis, and now you're saying you're not going to help her, but the symptoms are the same, which isn't really good. The things like people with hereditary spastic paraplegia aren't able to access things like MS clinics in some areas. In other areas, MS clinics are prepared to treat people with HSP. Because with the overlap of symptoms and with awareness of the condition, there's not going to be HSP clinics like there are MS clinics, and the specialty and the knowledge that they have is beneficial. There were also positive ways that receiving the diagnosis of HSP helped. For some people, it helped them plan. So one person gave the example of purchasing property. So like myself, I've purchased a ground floor flat near the seaside. So it's got a wet room. Basically, I'm future-proofing my life. It also helped people to be able to get support. So one person used the example of of basically universal credits that were giving him a real hard time to get work and not taking into consideration the level of fatigue and the level of disability he had. So actually, once he got the diagnosis, he was able to get things like physiotherapy and occupational therapy to help, but also they had to then accept that he did have a disability and look at a more practical plan for his future. It also gave people a focus for research. So people did a lot of reading up themselves and finding out about the condition, talking to others with the condition. So this was one of the things that did actually provide some benefit for people. Because people were provided with there was a lack of information provided to people at diagnosis. So basically 24% were given no information at diagnosis. 55% were given an explanation of HSP and 24% were given advice on symptom management. I think really future research needs to look in more depth at what support was offered, whether people were offered whether people were offered things like counselling. So the support group. So I'm a trustee in the support group because really when I was first diagnosed and I wanted to know more about the condition, that's where I reached out to, and that's been a real lifeline to myself and to others. I could see how much it helped. There were so many comments about how many about ways the support group helped, especially people feeling lonely and feeling on their own and having to deal with things alone. So since diagnosis, what physiotherapy treatment have you found helpful? So overall, the majority, by 58%, was stretching, which shows actually how much how useful stretching is. It's by far the exercise that most people find with HSP find beneficial. Now, that's partly because of the spasticity. But only 7 people had advice on exercise groups. And given the fact that it's looking at the long-term management, because actually our NHS physios are equipping people to manage it themselves because they're not able to provide that long-term treatment. So advice on exercise groups is very beneficial and not something that's done as often as could be. Okay. Experience of physiotherapy. Now, different people had experienced positives and negative experiences of physiotherapy. Now, some people experience both positives and negative experiences. One of the people I interviewed spoke about a really brilliant physiotherapist that they saw, and they were still doing exercises that physiotherapist had given to them years later. And then they went back to physiotherapy and the person in that role had changed and they had quite a negative experience. What what's made the difference between a negative and positive experience was not just the not just their understanding of the HSP and what the treatment was, but very much the communication and explanation. Those that explained why those exercises were important actually made a much bigger difference. There were people as well that used private physiotherapists. These were used in more than one way. So some people used private physiotherapists regularly and saw private physio on a regular basis, and other people saw private physiotherapists when, as soon as any problems arose. So for specific issues, so they have maybe started falling, so they go straight away. And this was beneficial in that you've not got the NHS waiting times, people are being proactive, but of course it does take a toll on people's finances. But physiotherapy did help people to understand to understand HSP and to understand their body and how it was impacting them. It helped to provide motivation for people. So it is very important. Now, exercise is the key. And this is a quote from one of the interviews from a lady who said that when she was diagnosed with HSP, she said to the consultant, "What medication can I have? How can you make it better?" And he said, "No medication, you need to exercise." And she'd never stepped foot in a gym and was absolutely horrified at the idea of doing exercise. She now loves exercise and she really sees how beneficial it is. And she said, exercise is the key. And I just thought, I love that quote. So I've used it. So it is very important for symptom management. When using exercise regularly for symptom management, it can be seen, when you go on holiday for a week and you've not exercised and you've been busy, and all of a sudden you wake up and you're stiff as a board. It's very clear that actually how much the exercise is benefiting. But overall, the exercise that people found most beneficial was that of stretches. This for many reasons, because like I said, with spasticity, your muscles aren't turning off, so they're getting shorter and shorter and they're pulling and pulling. So when you're stretching them, although stretching with spasticity is quite uncomfortable, but you're actually reducing the risk of contractures or reducing the contracture, because a lot of us have got reduction in range of movement already. So it is very important, and it does help to reduce the spasticity and to manage the condition. One of the things found, particularly in the interviews, was that people finding exercises that they enjoy was very important. So there was one gentleman who liked sailing, and he did sailability, and there was another gentleman who did wheelchair racing and was quite competitive with it, and that gave him motivation for doing other sorts of exercises as well. But finding something that you enjoy and have fun actually motivates you to keep going, because there were people that reported that they found exercise a chore and they did it just because they had to. And actually, well, stretches are a bit of a chore. I can't deny that. But most of the people in the study were actually exercising regularly. So most people did see the benefit of exercise and were continuing to exercise regularly. But there were barriers to exercise mentioned. So there were those that found physical limitations actually created a barrier for them. Reduced confidence. They didn't know what exercises they could do and what exercises would be beneficial. So they didn't do any. Although there was one person's comment that really made me smile. They said, I don't know what exercises are beneficial, so I just do what I like, what I enjoy. Which I thought, well, actually, that's fine. You know, but there were people that commented that they would need support to do exercise and that they didn't have that support available. There were the people that found time an issue. So when I was first diagnosed, I was working 34 hours a week and looking after 2 children. And time was definitely an issue. It's a limiting factor. So you're trying to squeeze in a lot of exercise to an already busy day. Access to, so using leisure centres and exercise groups is great, but people need to be able to get there and people need to be able to have the finances to fund that. Right? Energy conservation. With fatigue, sometimes people haven't got the energy to do the exercise that they want to do. Right? Motivation. Motivation is impacted by so many things. When people are going through the grief process after being diagnosed, they can become quite depressed. It's very difficult to motivate yourself to exercise when you feel depressed. So that has a huge impact on people's motivation. Pain also impacts people's motivation because, like I said, doing stretches are very uncomfortable. So, it's not always the most comfortable thing. But also when you're in a lot of pain, trying to motivate yourself to do exercise is 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 difficult. People's views of exercise. If people view it as a chore, it's harder to motivate themselves. Whereas if they view it as something they want to do, they're more inclined to do it. Convenience. Now, there was a good example of this in one of the interviews where a gentleman didn't really do a right lot of exercise because he'd lost his motivation. He'd done a lot of exercise for about 30 years. Bless him, he was getting older. But one of the things he did do was a seated yoga class, and that was in the village where he lived, and it was in the town hall across the road with his neighbours. So it was convenient, sociable, and so he did that regularly, which is quite beneficial. Yeah, so even though he lacked motivation, because there was an exercise class that was convenient for him, he did that. But also that social element, because you're chatting with all his friends, and exercise can be quite sociable, but it can also be quite lonely in large leisure centres where there isn't that sense of community. So swimming was by far the exercise that people were more inclined to do in the community. But there were people doing yoga and Pilates and doing aqua aerobics, tai chi, dancing, doing weights, doing the cardiovascular machines. So there are people doing a wide variety of different exercises in the community. Views of exercises. So, like I said, this has quite an impact on people's motivation. And it was very clear that actually people did enjoy sociable exercise, doing it with other people. And also they found it more motivating when they could see the difference. So, but then there were people who've had quite negative experiences, negative feelings towards exercise, and that made motivation much harder. Okay, so this is just the key findings. So the diagnosis process was difficult for many. Those with a known family history had a more straightforward diagnosis process, but only 16% had any awareness of HSP prior to diagnosis. The impact of diagnosis was quite large for most people, and there was a grieving response. Information was very limited. The HSP support group was very much valued, and even though there was actually only one question asked about the support group, and that was whether you were provided information on it, and 27% were, but a lot more than that actually commented when being asked about what information they were given. They said, the support group's been vital to finding that information. So it's a real important resource. Now, I know obviously this research is about HSP, but there are support groups for all different conditions. So it's very useful to use them and tap into that information. Let's move that up to that. Tap into that information for your patients. So the impact of physiotherapy. So although it was quite variable, there were some really positive examples of how physiotherapy had impacted people's self-management. But there were also real examples whereby a lack of knowledge and understanding of HSP was found. And the limitations and difficulty to access physiotherapy services was also a problem that was raised by many. The importance of exercise was a real key finding in this. Stretches were by far the exercises that were of most benefit to people, as well as exercises that people find sociable. And doing exercise in the community, people enjoyed more. And therefore, it was more motivating. It's difficult to motivate yourself to do something that you don't find fun, that you don't enjoy. So finding appropriate exercise classes with instructors wasn't always easy because not all instructors were aware of how to manage with a disabled person in the class. You know, there were some really good examples given whereby instructors were able to adapt exercises for them and making it much more accessible. But there were also examples given by people who had to stop doing exercise classes because they weren't able to, and instructors weren't able to give them support, or they also felt very self-conscious. You know, the gait pattern for HSP is quite noticeable, and it's quite an odd gait pattern. So people do feel quite self-conscious that they're not able to do the exercises that other people are. So like one lady who was interviewed went to aqua aerobics, but found that she couldn't do quite a bit of it. I suspect she probably could do some, but because of that, she never went back. She found that she was self-conscious, that she couldn't do things, and compared herself to the able-bodied people. There were quite a lot of them were older than her, and she was like, well, I shouldn't be like this because I'm only such and such age. But it's not about age, it's about acceptance of where you are and actually exercising for you. It's not about comparing yourself to other people. So basically, given that, one of the key findings was a real lack of information provided at diagnosis. One of the things I've done is help create an information sheet. Now, this information sheet's going out to the group of neurologists at the moment. So is currently being used. So hopefully people will be at least given a little bit more information at diagnosis. Okay. Just bear in mind when you see anybody with a rare neurological condition, there will be a support group, and also do a bit of reading up before you go to see the person or before they come to see you. If you're outpatient, you can tell I did community for a long time, and I hope this is a useful resource that can help to equip physiotherapists for the future. So goodbye. So, and good luck with your futures, everybody.